Verity, Professor Verity Brown, who happens to be the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Impact and Innovation from University of East London, who is a well-known international figure in a variety of fields, but also in the fields of this. So I'll let her introduce and set the frame for this discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak, Siraj. So really this does follow quite well from the last talk about, because essentially what I want to talk about is what is the point of an education. Because I think everybody in this room would agree that education is a good thing and that women should have it too. However, I think that what we educate ourselves and our children in is not fair. So this first slide is a cartoon, and if you can read it, it says, Audrey's mastery of warp drive technology was finally paying off. So the idea here is making the point that Audrey was probably wasting her time at university because she wasn't going to make any use of her physics education because she was going to end up in a kitchen. So that's sort of the joke behind this slide. Ellen Swallow Richards was an engineer, an American engineer, at the turn of the last century. And she was a chemical engineer. She specialised in sanitation systems. But of course, being a woman, she found herself at home, eventually. And so this is a quotation from her. She said, laboratory work, rightly carried out, makes women better housekeepers, better cooks, better wives, and mothers fitted to care for the versatile American youth. And of course, when she was talking about the versatile American youth, I think she was mainly probably talking about little boys, because they were going to go on to have this education. So the point she's making here is that she has to justify her own education and the education of the girls in these terms, that actually you better educate me because I'll be a better woman for it. Okay? Whereas in fact, we should have been celebrating, and she should have been celebrating the fact that we educate the girls for the same reason we educate boys, which is that this topic of our education is important, whatever it is. I think I'll make one other point here, and this is about arts education. So although one of the themes that we're looking at here is science and technology, in fact, art education is one of the first things to go in a system that sees itself short of money, that prioritises first boys' education, then it prioritises education in science and technology because that is where innovation is perceived to come from. But what was interesting about the last talk, we heard that getting hold of this science and this technology, actually people didn't know what to do with it. Probably because they hadn't been educated in how to use this thing. So being able to be creative in ways other than just simply creating an app or getting a job. Now, of course, I would also argue that there's another bias and prejudice that's happening here, which is that we keep people in their place by educating them for a job. We don't educate them for life, but to get a job, because that's how they're economically useful. But in fact, they become economically useless if they not only can't get a job, but don't know what to do with their free time because they're not educated, they're ignorant, as Olivia pointed out. So coming back to science briefly, what do these couples have in common? So Pierre and Marie Curie, Irene and Frédéric Joliot-Curie, he was the son of Pierre and Marie, obviously, and Carl and Gertie Corey. What they have in common is that they were all married scientists who also worked together. So, of course, the Curies very famously won a Nobel Prize together. These jointly awarded the Nobel Prize, indicating that the sum can be greater than the sum of the partners. The whole is greater than the sum of the partners. There's another example I'll give, a mathematician called William Young. He was the tutor to Grace Christholm. And he didn't have a PhD. This is early in the last century. And it was she who did have a PhD in mathematics. But nevertheless, his career, and by all accounts this was a mutual decision they both made, they prioritised his career as a mathematician. And so she did the work and he got the credit. I think these days, that happens much less. It's much less common to see those kinds of partnerships, in part because of an ethical thing in science about giving credit where it's due. But nevertheless, there is this idea that sometimes the woman scientist is in the second place. So here's another interesting fact for you. 45% of married female physicists are married to other physicists. I don't know why it's making that noise. However, only 6% of married male physicists have a wife who is also a physicist. So why did this difference come about? Well, obviously, scientists, physicists in particular, but many scientists, spend a lot of time in the lab. And if you're a female and you spend a lot of time in the lab, that's your chance to meet men. That's where you go and find your dates, which is why you end up marrying them in the lab. But there are difficulties of this. The first is being taken seriously. Are you a scientist first, or are you the wife mother? Are you the support act? A second problem is a very practical problem, which is finding jobs in the same university, or even in the same town, or sometimes even in the same country. And very often academic couples make very long commutes. And then, of course, there's this credit sharing thing. How do we make sure that the men and the women in these partnerships get the appropriate share of both the resources and also the credit for their work? And then, of course, there's the sharing, the caring, as well as everything else. So I'm not a physicist. You might think I was a physicist. I'm not actually a physicist. I'm a neuroscientist. But there's a problem in physics called the two-body problem that was described by Newton. And the two-body problem, which is explained by this equation here, it's a classic, I'm just going to read this out in case you can read it. It's a classic problem in physics, is that of describing the resultant motion of two objects when they're subjected only to their mutually attractive force. For the case of two astronomical bodies, planets and stuff, which are mutually attracted by gravitation, Newton showed that the motion is confined to a plane, and that the motion of one body with regard to the other follows a curve. This solution, however, has only limited application in practice because of the presence of other bodies. So the problem of exactly determining the relative motion of three or more bodies has yet to be solved. So that's adapted from an encyclopedia. So here's a further adaptation of the two-body problem. A classic problem in academia is that of describing the resultant career trajectories of two scientists when they are subjected to mutually attractive force. For the case of two scientist bodies, which are mutually attracted by intellectual interests, surveys have shown that the motion is confined. The problem is further increased because of the presence of other bodies, who may or may not be impeded by the same forces on a job shortlist. The problem of exactly determining the career motions of such bodies has yet to be solved. So what I'm arguing here is that it's often women's careers that tank at the point at which they get married. So what's the solution to the two-body problem? What can an institution do? Well, there are things called spousal deals. These are more common in US institutions. These are arrangements whereby when you hire one person, you hire their partner in order to keep them together. It's actually not used very much in the UK, in part because employment laws make it a little bit difficult. But there is the odd thing that we know that two clever people attract to other clever people. In other words, clever people don't tolerate not very clever people. So it tends to be that if you do get one good academic, you're likely to find that their spouse is also a good academic. And then what can scientific couples do for themselves? Well, obviously, two positions or job sharing or commuter relationships about all they've got. Interestingly, there is myths around women's productivity. So marriage and productivity, married women PhDs in science publish as much as single women, and having successive children is also not associated with lower rates of publication. So this is something that's frequently told, but it's actually, there's no evidence to suggest that women's productivity falls as a result of being married or having children. However, children are a problem. So when you have 3, 4 or more body problems, you end up having to balance work and other things. So what could we do about this? So there's a book, one of my favourite books is Ms. Mentor's Impeccable Advice for Women in Academia by Emily Toth. And her career preservation tactic is to suggest that Ms. Mentor wants women to have power in academia now. A team of women, all tenured, can speak with one voice and make changes. Only tenured professors have the power in academia, and so women need to get tenure. Okay, so I don't have any recommendations. I have a small reading list here. I think the fact that so many books have been written about this and the fact that we're still talking about this all these decades after people like Ellen Swerdlow Richards was talking about it, I think I despair at how the progress is glacially slow. A young woman was earlier today told to grab the opportunities, and oh yes, you do have to do that, because only by getting tenure can you make a difference. You have to be in those positions to be able to make a difference. Thank you very much.
So please remember, if we all help and do a little bit, it will make a big difference.